Hi. I didn't know we had started, but I'm Nora Lawrence. I'm executive director at Storm King Art Center. Very excited to be with you all here at Aspen Ideas. I'm here with Ronald Rial, architect and artist from UC Berkeley, and Beatriz Cortez, who I have worked with at Storm King, an incredible artist who is based at UC Davis. Among both of you having these broader practices than either of the things I've mentioned. We are going to start off from hearing from Beatriz and have you take us through some images of your work and talk them through. But I think we're going to have a great conversation with two artists who are really thinking in connected terms about their practices and the effect that art can have in kind of making a change and bringing things to light within our world. Beatriz, will you start us off?
Sure. Well, thank you for this invitation. I'm so delighted to be in conversation with Ron and with you again, Nora. And thank you all for being here. What I wanted to show you are a few pieces where I think that our work connects in so many ways that we had to be minimal because of the time constraints. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how for me there's multiple temporalities in the world and time is not moving in a linear way. And so I entered into what some could consider an architectural type of art making or art projects because I was looking for places where in Los Angeles I would feel that to be present meant that seeing Los Angeles through my eyes as an immigrant from El Salvador, I could see the different temporalities in the spaces. And there's this Los Angeles vernacular type of architecture, which in many ways in the narrative of it erases these multiple temporalities. And I was really interested in making this dome, which is my next door neighbor's dome in San Fernando, where I used to live. That was made by an Apache Mezcalero builder who built all these porches in different parts of Los Angeles, in La Cañada, La Crescenta, Pasadena, and in San Fernando. And his name was Dan Montelongo. And he built, I mean, there's similar porches to these, but he built very peculiar porches where the rocks are protuberant and they are huge. And they reminded me, I immediately felt an indigenous builder was here. And this neighborhood was built by an indigenous builder. And knowing that and having the presence of ancient forms of technology and ways of construction became really important for me. And also, it was important that my next door neighbor, Connie, is a Lakota woman because a Lakota woman lived in the porch that was built by an Apache Mezcalero. Now that the neighborhood is very inexpensive, that working class families have inhabited the houses, it took about 100 years for her to own that house from the time that he made it till the time that she came. But in a poetic way, it said a lot to me about immigrants in Los Angeles, in the immigrants that clean the gardens and clean the houses and raise many children. 100 years from now, will also live in those houses. And so it was bringing me all these messages that I thought were so important. And then building a space capsule, thinking a lot about that, I tried to incorporate one more layer. This space capsule also has the industrial part of Los Angeles, the rocks that I learned from Dan Montelongo, a colonial style of architecture, and it also has a craftsman style of architecture, all of it together. So this space capsule, which had a trunk where I could fit and a stairway where you could go to the tent when there's no gravity, it's really easy to go to the tent and hang out there. And then I had my bookshelf, a desk, and my fireplace. Thinking of how to build a place where, in a world, how to build worlds where we could all fit together, required for me to incorporate all these layers of diverse forms of understanding how to build a home. But I also want to show you some other works that speak of migration in a different way and that are large-scale works that also speak of non-human experiences of migration. So in the case of this rock, this is called glacial erratic, and it's a large-scale boulder that I imagined moved from thousands of miles from one landscape to another landscape where nothing around it was familiar, and that it was moved by the ice melting and by the spaces around Earth that is warming up. In the case of this work, Chultún el Semillero, I was imagining a space capsule not for rocks, but for seeds. And in all of those instances, the rocks and the understanding of the rocks, the seeds and the way of thinking of the seeds, the way of placing the rocks, spoke of ancient forms of technologies that were inherited to us by the ancestors. And so later on, when I thought of this volcano, Ilopango, which was installed at Storm King, that's where I met Nora. This volcano was, Ilopango was also important for me during the pandemic. I was making this piece thinking of how the particles of this volcanic eruption that happened in the year 536 before El Salvador was El Salvador ended up covering the sun, darkening the sun for about 18 months, cooling the earth, and landing all over the planet. And later on, I went to the Arctic looking for particles of this volcanic eruption. But it also taught me that wherever I go, including Aspen, wherever I walk, even if I'm having altitude sickness, there's some particles of the earth, of the underworld, that is sacred to my ancestors that are here under my feet. And that made migration warmer and more important. I went super fast over this slide where the volcano is navigating and carrying out a performance over the Hudson River. I'm going from Storm King to the MPAC at the RPI. And I wanted to finally end with a discussion about the Arctic. As I said, I went to the Arctic looking for a particle of this volcanic eruption. But I found architectures that were non-human, architectures that were not meant for humans, and that were so beautiful and fleeting. And I ended up making this work called Adrift in a Mirrored Sea, Hans Buchta, in homage to that iceberg that I was able to witness at that moment. But to me, what was really important is that there's these forms of architecture that exist that are not always meant for us, that archways are not always meant for our bodies, that architecture and structures can be self-built because matter is intelligent and self-organizing, etc. So I'm going to stop there because we have so much to talk about.
Thank
so here you go, Ron.
Thank you, Beatriz.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's so inspiring. I'm chiefly an architect. I'm a professor of architecture, and I'm probably most well known for this project that I did along the US-Mexico border in 2019, inserting with my team 3 teeter-totters into the wall as a moment of bringing people from both sides together in a joyous act of play. For me, borders aren't places that divide, which is the common preconception of borders, but for me, borders are places where things come together, whether it's countries come together, or languages, or food, or different beliefs, cultural beliefs, religious beliefs. And so it's the borderlands, for me, that are a productive laboratory about design, about new ways of making things by bringing things together. When Beatriz and I talk, we talk in Spanglish. We go back and forth. We have foods that are combined with different parts of the world with ingredients that come together to make new flavors. And so the borderlands are really exciting for me because they are these spaces for thinking about what happens when you bring 2 things together in space. These are also acts of culture jamming. They're acts of rebellion, they're acts of resistance, these projects that I'm going to show you. Not long after this project took place, which was in the first, at the beginning of the Trump administration. At the end of the Trump administration, when Biden became president, he stopped all border wall construction. And there were hundreds of thousands of pounds of steel left fallow alongside the US-Mexico border. So we smuggled 10,000 pounds of that steel and took it to a museum and made this project that we call House United, Casa Unida. And we took the steel, which defines the bottom and the top rungs that hold those vertical pieces in place, to create a house that invites you in, that kind of lifts the veil and opens up to light and space. And why am I so interested in borderlands? My studio is based here in Colorado, and my family's been living in Colorado for the last 7 generations, and we're from the region and have been inhabiting Colorado for the last several thousand years. So my interest in the borderlands is because if we go as the crow flies 30 miles south from here, we are at the former historic US-Mexico border along the Arkansas River. And this is where my family has lived for a very long time. And many of my projects involve thinking about the space of the historic border. I am fascinated by the building material of the borderlands, which is adobe. Adobe is made of only earth and straw and water and sun and wind and nothing else. And we might think that building material is a building material for the poor. We might think that it's only in certain countries, but in fact, it's on every single continent except for one, the frozen continent. And it spans a range of economic stature, different people in urban settings and rural settings. And the home of the first lieutenant governor of the state of Colorado lived in a palatial adobe mansion in southern Colorado. His name was Lafayette Head. And he later became Indian agent to the Tabawacha Ute tribe. 2/5 of this building no longer exists today, but I am a steward of this building, and this project here re-excavated this building to remake adobes, and all the artifacts that I found in looking for home in this building. This house is called Exhuming Home, which is a space where the Indian agent documented all enslaved Native Americans in the 2 counties, Conejos and Costilla County in Colorado, after the Civil War. And those are the ancestors of my community. And so in looking for that history, I'm not only metaphorically digging up the earth, but digging up the research, but finding them and putting them on display. And this is now just opened this weekend at the Fort Garland Museum, if you happen to head south. Yeah, thank you. So this fascination I have with things coming together and earth ultimately led me to bring 2 things together that were kind of unexpected: robots and mud. And so for the last 7 years, I've been exploring the way robots can 3D print buildings made out of mud. And so many of my experiments explore that possibility. These are 15-foot tall silos that you can find in the borderlands of southern Colorado in a little town called Center, that are a meditation on the relationship between earth and sky. I also just opened this project in Taos, New Mexico, kind of a cross-border project between Colorado and New Mexico, and 3D printed this structure, which has a series of seating and shade, and the first 3D printed horno, which you're looking at. An horno is a mud oven where we activate with the community and cook bread and food. And last year, I made what is the largest 3D printed earthen structure in the world, which is this project for Desert X. And my ambitions are that in this act of resistance and exploration and coming together, we can reimagine adobe buildings as a way to think about architecture in the 21st century. And it's critical at a time when I was talking with Beatriz, who unfortunately lost her house in the fires in Los Angeles last year, that in those fires, those homes burned, leaving excessive amounts of toxins in the air and in the land and in the water and in our bodies. And so we're at a moment where the ecological crisis and the crisis of toxicity are important to address, and architecture has been complicit in that for the last 200 years, at least. And so returning to buildings made of earth are one way towards that. And I'm just going to leave you with a very short video that gives you a little more sense of how this all works. Oops, I think I did it backwards. I need Hector here to do it. I can't do it by myself. I envisioned about 16 years ago a future of earthen construction that involved 3D printing, an evolving experiment that's teaching me how to do a delicate dance with this robot. It's very intimate. I'm touching the mud, I'm feeling the mud, I'm touching the hose, I'm controlling the robot, I'm moving all around it. Fingers crossed. I love the way it feels, the way it smells, the way the light falls on it, the textures. I want the audience to feel all that, and also to connect between the past and the future. We naturally have a visceral connection to earthen structures, and we feel them and we understand them because we evolved to build them. My name is Ronald Rael, and this is the Adobe Oasis.
Thank you. That was amazing. I learned more about both of your practices, and I'm excited for this conversation. I wanted to ask both of you. So now I think it's going to scroll, right? Images will be on, so we can sort of reference things as they come up. To both of you, the idea of time comes up in a number of different ways, and I'd love to ask you a little bit more about that because it's really interesting. And I've heard from you in particular, Beatrice, about a connection of the past and the future also being about kind of a decentering of something that we might think of a human lifespan, right? And how our world is moving at paces that are not necessarily our shared pace, but something a little bit larger than that. And I know that you're both looking at things like this, but I'd love to hear from both of you.
I want to ask for your help looping the presentation, please.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Well, I think that my work has as its central, the motor of it is to try to step away from the idea that time is linear. Because the idea that time is linear takes us towards the idea of progress and acceleration and the destruction of the planet at the end. And so it comes with a Darwinian understanding of who we are, of who indigenous peoples are. And I am invested in the survival of indigenous peoples, in imagining futures where indigenous peoples thrive at the end. And where we thrive because indigenous peoples developed technologies and we pay attention to them. And so when I'm imagining the future, it's always informed by the past. And whether it's a spaceship, a space capsule, a house, a glacial erratic, an iceberg, it's filled with the different gifts of generosity that ancestors sent to us. And these gifts of generosity don't arrive to us in a linear form. They arrive to us in circular forms at different time frames, and we just have to catch them. But the world is filled with, it's like having buried treasures everywhere. They're coming to us. And so pointing them out, sharing them with others, that's what I do. And I think that only is possible when we think of time, not only as circular, but also multiple and simultaneous.
I think there's also a way in which if a linear process of time leads to, as I think, sort of our optimistic world often just takes for granted, to progress, right? As you mentioned, then there isn't a need for anyone to sort of intervene or do anything because, it's just going to be fine. So I think that's also a nice way of thinking about it, is that these ends that we're assuming, I think you're right, really need to be questioned and kind of continuously discussed and considered. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so much of what Beatrice was just saying was really thoughtful, and I was kind of parsing it out right now, thinking about this idea of the problem with thinking about time on a linear spectrum, and that maybe what I'm trying to do is connect the past and the future. And often when I lecture, people say, "Oh, how cool! You're taking the most primitive technology with the most advanced technology." And I said, "Yes, I am. I'm taking the most advanced technology, which is earth and materials which we've developed for 10,000 years as humans, and mixing them with this like really clunky robots that don't work so well." And so, to think about technology as a linear spectrum is a problem. And so what I'm trying to do is recognize at any point these can come together and make something entirely new. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really lovely.
Also, there's something so beautiful in how not only each one of these adobes represent a history, like you're building an archive with adobes, but adobe, the material, is filled with life and it's filled with seeds and with potentiality, and so it's also beautiful to think about that.
I also was struck by some resonances. Should I call you Ronald or Ron?
Either one.
Okay.
Doesn't matter.
Ronald, with your mention of this kind of this border that has moved, right? And this thing that we take now is so fixed. I mean, we saw the project and we're of the teeter-totter, and we're thinking of the wall in so many ways today. But thinking of that as not fixed reminds me a lot also of Beatrice, your work and the way that you've kind of put a lie to this, right? Like I see both of you thinking through the ways that anyone who isn't a human has kind of fair passage between these kind of lines that are sort of invented, right? Like you have talked about, I think that's what I've heard from you, has to do with the ash, and the volcanic ash can travel more readily than a human can, right? Or Ronald, I was even noticing in the footage that we were looking at of the teeter-totter that camera is in a place of both, right?
Yeah.
That you wouldn't be able to access otherwise. But I think that's really interesting. And I do even start conflating kind of time and place as I think about all of this, because I feel like they're so connected within what you do. But yeah.
Yeah, and I also think that there's a speculative dimension to my work that I also see in your work. That speculative dimension can appear in play. For example, if we're playing and we're playing a game and you kill me and I'm like, "No, Ron, but I didn't feel well. Can I please be alive again?" And you're like, "Okay, fine, but let's go to New Mexico because it's a little lower." Okay, and we can be in New Mexico in 1 second, because play is speculative, and there's something speculative about imagining these structures and imagining these shapes. And I see that house made of pieces of the border, which I hadn't seen before. And it makes me think of un abanico, a fan, like a Spanish fan that from colonial times. And I think that there's so many shapes and forms that are part of our, thought, because we have seen them in the different spaces that we inhabit, that some of those are colonial and some of those are indigenous and some of those are pointing towards this acceleration of modernity, but they come out of our mind and turn into a generous space of potentiality and speculative futures. And I think that's beautiful. And I love the idea of that house, because all the perforations become lace and become light entering through these beautiful designs, and then one would never suspect what the border once was in that future.
Yeah, there's something about movement that I think exists in all this work, whether and part of it's this idea of migration, but there's also an idea of I'll call it provenance. Like, where do things come from, and what's special about the places that those things came from, whether they're people or materials or ideas. Like, I love this as an idea of migration. A volcano that becomes not a volcano, that becomes a volcano, that gets on a boat and takes a trip. And that it's really poetic and beautiful and playful. And I think the teeter-totter, which for me is is simply an idea of that you take the same material that's in the vertical that keeps people away and you turn it 90 degrees and now it connects people. So one material can have many stories. Beatrice was telling me that many of these things were made out of car hoods from a junkyard in LA. And suddenly those materials become something so fantastical and beautiful.
And my domes, which are a conversation with this dome and Bucky's domes, but also are a conversation with ancient domes, because domes are indigenous and many domes have 2,000 years, more years. And, I always disagreed with his patents because I thought, well, indigenous peoples designed them as well, and they should be shared patents, et cetera, et cetera. But don't get me started. I think that there's something really beautiful about making a dome as a metaphor for shelter, because a lot of my domes with car hood pieces and with steel, I placed them in Marfa, where they were in conversation with Donald Judd's works and also with Chamberlain's works, but they were also in conversation with the headquarters of the Border Patrol, which are next door. And so for me to have a geodesic dome that's called shelter is also a way to survive being a brown artist in a place like Marfa, where you're building an archway with Rafa Esparza on this side of the road, and the Border Patrol is detaining two workers in the gas station across the street. And there's nothing you can do because there's nothing you can do, and you're in Texas, And so there's so many things that are really important, that you can open up a small portal to another dimension where this dome can be about play and can be about joy.
I think also, Ronald, some of your work has, I know you've done a snow globe of kind of imagery of the border wall, and kind of asking like, well, why isn't this in sort of this type of popular culture? Creating these juxtapositions that really call out some of these absurdities. And some of what I've seen within your works and play, really for both of you, but in one way for you, Ronald, it's so research-based also. I mean, looking at things that you've just discovered about the history of how the border walls have been tested with maybe a car just slamming into them. That's actually research when it seems so completely absurd. It's interesting to kind of, have that sense of play move full circle a little bit, or use the ability to have something lighthearted also call attention to such incredibly heavy, unbelievable stuff.
Yeah, well, plays a way into those conversations that makes it very easy, right? I wrote a book called Border Walls Architecture, and it talks about how the border wall is an architecture of violence, and it's a biography of the wall. And it tells stories about the construction of the wall and its effects spatially on people and animals, and where it comes from as a designed structure. And so, the way for me into those conversations are through play. And the snow globes, I built a series of architectural models that are snow globes that are illustrations of those stories. Like one story is that there's a wall and there's little graves on both sides and there's a cat on top of the wall, and you look at that and you think how cute, and it kind of diminishes that idea, so you can take on the story, which is that the federal government bulldozed through and built a border wall through a Native American burial ground. And so to access that story, because if we just presented that story up front, sometimes people look away, and I think it's really important to take those issues on.
It's a means by which you can really capture people and draw them in, and then have them kind of tease apart the significance of it. Yeah. Beatrice, could you speak a little bit? Ronald has spoken about his materials and the significance of his materials. And I know that I've talked to you a lot about the process of welding and the materials you've used as being significant within your work, and we haven't touched on that quite yet.
Yeah, well, I work largely with steel and also with plants. And I think for me, both of those, seeds, plants, steel, are related to the earth, and in many ways similar to adobe. This kind of process is hard labor, and it's coming from the earth, but it's organic, and it can be read as industrial, depending how we work on it, and it can go back to becoming organic. And I love, engaging in conversation with those folks who talked about back to the land, and because for me, steel, through the hammering of the steel, I am manipulating the steel to remove the industrialization out, to return it to being rocks, to return it to being boulders and being glacial erratics and icebergs, and return it to being earth.
And am I right that even the process of hammering is kind of casting the earth below it sometimes? There's sand is involved, right? And
Sand,
yeah,
yes.
yeah.
On sandbags is usually where we beat the metal. So all those things to me are related, but also the plants, I think they're important. There's a long story of, I've done a lot of research about the history of the, there were in the United States, the creation of the agricultural explorer programs. Before the Department of Agriculture, people were sent to different places to bring, for example, that image of Ron's work with a palm tree makes me think of that, because palm trees were brought here, oranges were brought here, dates were brought here. And so the creation of all these monocrops for profit required somebody going somewhere else, whether it was India, Latin America, to bring avocados. Avocados are from Guatemala and El Salvador, but they are California avocados now. And to bring those things for profit. And so I was really interested in how the migration of plants is so connected to eugenics, to the history of the idea of white supremacy, and how they carry that history, and also how they carry the history of migration of people who hide the seeds that represent their home in their socks or in their suitcase, and bring them and plant them so that they can have a plant that reads as home in their backyard. And so all those migrations of plants, I'm really interested in how plants write the history of that relationship to them that our country has had, and also that we have been taught to have, but also that our ancestors have taught us other things. And so plants are this complicated being that creates a world, and at the same time that carries so many histories. So I've published about the memory of plants and the migration of plants, and all these archives that I found at Caltech in the genetics department.
Could you also speak about, we're talking about some speculative histories and futures, and you were speaking about your hope for Indigenous futures. One thing that we haven't touched on yet also is a sense of spirituality within your work. And Ronald, if you would want to respond to this, I'd love to hear that as well.
Yes. Well, I think that all these things coming from the earth have this potentiality of carrying spirituality from the ancestors who are also under the earth, and also from indigenous communities that have taught us so much. And I collaborate with a Maya Cachiquel community that writes about how objects that come from under the earth carry with them the ability to allow us to form community with the ancestors. And so for them, these objects should not be turned into artifacts. They should be allowed to be spiritual objects, because objects are for them alive. And the idea that objects are alive is really important. Yesterday, there was another panel here about that. And that was really beautiful to hear from other perspectives, the idea that matter is alive, that it carries spirituality, and that it can hold us and carries life. And so I would love to hear also what you think about that.
Yeah, I think a lot about it, especially in the relationship to what I'm doing, which is like trying to continue an architectural tradition that's connected to Earth, that my family has practiced for probably continuously several thousand years. And what it means to dig into the earth to make home. And as someone who's really fascinated with earthen buildings, I'm often looking at the bricks themselves as these archival repositories of history. So we can look at certain adobes from older homes, and we might find bits of bone fragment in them or bits of pottery in them. And later we might find glass or plastic shards, or, so you see that there are archives. And in the project Exhuming Home, the archive got completely mixed up. I even took archaeologists there to see if there was any reason to have a kind of reverence to it, and they said no, it's been so destroyed and bulldozed and everything. So they said, you can do whatever you want. And so I decided to give them reverence by categorizing them and cataloging them and saying what they were. And there was some, I think they're all special items, whether they're bone fragments or nails or books. But there are some that are a bit more elevated for me and a bit more special. I'll just tell you one quick story. Is that there's an individual who grew up in that Indian agency, and he became my friend, and he helped me make a number of those bricks. And he would tell me stories about what it was like growing up in the Indian agency. And he told me, when I was a kid, my father had us dig the outhouse. And so we dug several feet into the earth, and we found a body. And we found a body that was wrapped in leather and fringe and a breastplate, and it was a Native American ancestor.
Wow.
And my father said, "Tapalu, tapalu, cover it up, cover it up." And they moved and they dug the outhouse someplace else. And this must have been 60 years ago that this happened, 70 years ago. And I said, "Michael, can you show me where that grave was?" And we went over there, and you would never know that there's anything or anyone or anything happened there. And we both looked down at the ground, and I saw something, and I bent down, and I saw the largest piece of obsidian I have ever found. And I took it to the archaeologist, and they said, "Wow, that traveled here over 200 miles, anywhere between 200 and 1,000 years ago to that site." And so I don't know if that was placed there purposefully and intentionally or not,
breathtaking,
but it was just a super profound moment that challenged you to connect through what is very scientific and archival to something that's spiritual and beyond.
My friends from Cajay say that ancient objects, they have a will and they have a life, and they decide who to reveal themselves to.
It's really beautiful. Wow.
Yeah.
You've both talked about different collaborators, both formal and informal. How are you thinking about your own research now? I mean, I'm thinking, Ronald, you've talked about working with different archaeologists, and Beatrice, I know about this trip you took to the Arctic Circle, and I'd love to hear how you think about things that aren't specifically when you're making, but how do you find what you're looking for?
You want to start?
You go.
I can start.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, right now I'm making some new works, and I think I needed, it took me a while. There was a fire, my place burned down, and that slowed me down. But I have always been carrying the weight of being in the Arctic, because in the Arctic, where I went in Svalbard, when we went on expedition and out at sea, there was no one there. So when you went to the land, you could see the circles made by sound, by the vibration of matter. You could see the earth sifting through and putting the small pebbles here, the larger pebbles there, and creating all these circles as if it was a little bit of sand that you threw over a speaker, And it was amazing to see so many things. But one day I said, there's a little leaf of mint, let's make a mojito. And we went on a Zodiac to get a piece of chunk of ice. And on the way there, we got distracted and started looking with a microscope. And it was filled with all these zooplankton that have really, stayed with me, that there's millions of these little creatures that we can see with our eyes in the water and in the ice, and that I've been thinking a lot about them and trying to make them in different size, so that human scale is not what defines them. And so I've been trying to think of non-human ways of seeing, and making a work for Japan for a triennial in Japan, and that work is about the Pacific Ocean as well, and it's about a cave that was located in what is the town of Acajutla when my ancestors were there. The Spaniards came, and Pedro de Alvarado, he was this very cruel conqueror, and he was hit by an arrow in Acajutla, and he says that indigenous people were ahead of me, and then they were behind me. I don't get it, he said in his letter. But the Japanese came to El Salvador and built a port there to create a dry canal. So this was about the world market, etc. And so all these things tied together. For me, there is a cave there, and this cave, when there's low tide, you can enter it and you can hide there. And when there's high tide, you can't get out, but you can be safe up there. And when there's low tide, you can get out again. And every 6 hours, the tide changes. So basically, the cave and knowing the land is the way that our ancestors survived. And I'm really interested in that. So I'm building that cave and thinking about all this spirituality, but also about the landscape.
Amazing. Thank you.
How do you find what you're looking for is the question?
Or just how are you thinking about research now, and how are you kind of looking
Yeah.
outside your process, your making process to
Well, you
others?
just finished 4 projects 2 days.
Yeah, I know.
So maybe sleep.
I mean, one of the so this exhibition, if I could talk about it for a second, is all contemporary artists who use Adobe in their practice in the Americas. There are so many artists, but they've narrowed it down to 5 or so, and it's at the Harvard Museum in Taos and at the Fort Garland Museum in Fort Garland. And what's interesting about that is that both museums are actually made of Adobe. The fort is built in 1858, and what you see on the inside and what you see on the outside is Adobe all the way through. The Harvard Museum in Taos has been covered with many, many inches of cement plasters and lime plasters and latex paints. And so after, we're almost finished all the install, and it's a late Friday, and we're all tired, and me and Rafa Esparza, who is collaborated with Beatriz, we say, this building's made out of Adobe, but nobody knows because it's covered with all this stuff. And it's a kind of guerrilla project. We took a diamond blade saw and we cut on the interior of the museum, and we pulled out and exposed a line of the Adobe from 1916 to show people that this museum was
Totally
made out of
amazing.
Adobe. And
Wow.
so I think when
Yeah.
not to be so, it's not a pun, but to find what you're looking for, you just got to dig.
Yeah.
And you'll find it.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
We'd love to take some questions from the audience now. Mike's coming your way.
Thanks for Raul. Thanks for sharing the video. I do a little bit of 3D printing, but with thin filament or out of a resin bed. So seeing the robot was pretty awesome. And I have a boring a technical question. So as the mud's coming out, do you mix any stabilizer with that, or no?
No cements, no plastics, no epoxies, nothing.
Wow.
Just ancestral intelligence. That's the AI that's employed there.
And not even any micro pulverized straw or anything?
There is straw. So earth and straw and water. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for this. My name's Anatola, and I'm very inspired by making architecture out of raw earth materials, especially using 3D printing and other kinds of technologies. So the work that you're doing and initiatives like Seed in Mexico City that also is 3D printing housing using raw earth materials, or ideas of other villages in Mexico and I think California who had smaller 3D printed homes that are affordable housing. But I'm curious what you think about the scalability of this and designing the infrastructure for these things in the US specifically, or if you think it's most viable elsewhere, and how you think the pathway can be laid out to truly have it be a more widespread truth basis.
Yeah. Maybe the scalability is the biggest part of that question, and it's totally possible. The big part of that is the bureaucracy behind building, and earthen building is in all building codes. It's recognized, and the mathematics of engineering earthen buildings are understood, and there are multi-story buildings in the world that have been around for hundreds, if not thousands of years. There's one just a short drive from here, a day's drive from here in Taos Pueblo that's 5 stories tall, that's 1,000 years old, that people still live in. So the scalability is totally possible. I think that it starts to get into ideas beyond creativity, which are economics and market and everything else. And that's something we just got to work on.
I wanted to add something about your question. In Marfa, I remember there's this big wall that Donald Judd, when he came to Marfa, as a sculptor, built, but he didn't trust the adobe. And so he put adobe bricks and cement between them to make it more safe or powerful. But that holds the water in place, and so the water, instead of draining, drains the adobe out, so that all the adobe houses are fine except that one. That became like a lace. The absence of the adobe and the concrete became a lace, and it's really interesting to think about that we don't trust it because we have been taught that concrete is the more powerful, and that steel, which is what I use, is more powerful. But steel is so malleable and so soft. And I work with it every day. I can tell you that if you beat it, it becomes warm, and so we have been taught because of modernity that ancient technologies are not top of the line, but they are.
Wonderful. Yeah, let's wait for the mic.
Is that a deer?
That is a deer. I've been watching that deer. It's amazing.
Thank you all for the great conversation. My name is Alejandro, and my question is for both of you on the sense of, I'm left with Ronald's words of this intimate dance with the robot, but I can't help but think about the way that technology, automation is taking the human element more and more out of it. With both of you working with such modern technology, with the welding, with the 3D printing, what happens when that intimate dance is lost, when the human touch is not there anymore, and just it's just the technology without the human piece there? How do we prevent that? Is that inevitable to the point of linear time? What changes?
Well, I can tell you about my own process. It's impossible because I don't really use software. I improvise everything. I make everything myself. I have studio assistants who help me prepare materials, but I weld everything myself, and I look at each piece and I say, oh, now it needs to go this way. Now it needs to go that way. And so since I don't draw it, nobody can fabricate it for me. I wish sometimes that I could tell them, this is what's in my mind, please do it so I can go take a nap. But I am using a welder like an extension of myself, because all of us are machine. We're not human anymore. I have contacts and other things in my body. I don't think that we count as, totally human. And so we are this hybrid of the world we live in, but how we relate to these materials and how we improvise with them is really important.
Yeah. I say in that video an intimate dance, because when I'm working on the robot, it's helpful for me, my body, to be up against the robot so I know where it's going. And it's really about not getting the hose tangled up. Sometimes I think it's like a horse and you're just dealing with the rope and the horse, and you have to touch it and pet it and move with it. But I think the bigger question is about the loss of labor, like how it replaces labor. And I'll be honest, as someone who's done a lot of labor in my life, but has seen people who've done much, much more labor than me, I don't romanticize it at all. I think that if a machine can save the body to do something else, let it. Mixing mud, picking up heavy things, pushing things, building. I think that's my optimistic future, is that labor is transformed into something else. The architecture, by rule, with a capital A, forever has been made with slaves or people who have not been treated very fairly in building. And if we can guide machines and we can have agency in making machines help humans so that humans can do something else, I'm all for it.
Interesting answer.
I want to add something super fast. I don't think that also the creative process is only happening in the moment when you're making something, but how we plan, design things, we scan things. I think that our time allows us to cross walls and see things from the backside or so I think that those are the moments when it's more important. But I have a pallet jack that lifts my pieces, and
Yeah.
Yeah, and the tools can be part of the iterative creative process. I mean, we can make things over and over with the robot, and the same thing. I mean, I remember when I first started doing 3D printed workshops with clay 8 years ago at different art centers around the country, including up here in Snowmass, Anderson Ranch, and people were so skeptical of it because I remember one woman hearing the 3D printer, and I overheard their conversations. What's that sound? And the woman said, "That's the sound of our obsolescence." And I'm like, and it's just there was some point the wheel came around in pottery, and I'm sure those conversations were being had then. Like, no more
different-
hinge pots, no more
Different eras
coil.
of the same. Yeah.
And I think we're in the era of the same, and we have to use these tools to our advantage to expand our creativity and not see them as something that replaces our creativity.
Yeah. Can we take one more? Yeah.
Hi, my name's Evan. I was wondering, since you're doing art that's based on building and some of it even community installation, how do you negotiate your self-critique process with engaging with community members who, when they see community, art that they can touch, they usually either want to worship it, commercialize it, or burn it. And I'm sure when you create it, you have your own intentions. Do you just release it into the community and then walk away from it? Or how do you balance that critique with their input?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that Beatrice's work is very architectural, but she's working within the realm of art. And my work, people think looks like art, but it's really like unfinished architecture. And I don't know. But I think when you work with communities, and if you really want the projects to be successful, you have to allow the communities to take ownership of the work. So
and then they care for it.
and then they care for it. I will be very honest about a project that I did in Southern Colorado, which my own community made 40,000 adobes to build this enormous labyrinth. My version of that labyrinth was very austere, very minimal, very pure. But they built it and they took ownership of it and they added santos and decorations and all these things to it. And I really wish, and homemade furniture and all these things. And I wish it was pure, but it's not. But they love it. They love it so much, and it's theirs, and you just have to respect that. Yeah.
Do you want to respond to that, Beatrice?
No, I think I did.
Yeah.
We did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
There's another question, but I don't know if we have time for it.
One more.
Okay.
One more. I think one more sec. Thank you.
Thank you for taking my question. I work with little ones. I work a lot on like sensory integration and helping them calm their bodies. And I've been in a lot of different environments. And I've always believed, not necessarily from like all my research, but that the buildings that we have kids learn in often are creating these reactions that make it really hard for them to learn. And then as a therapist, bringing things into my office that basically mimic the earth in order to help children calm down. And I'm fascinated with the Adobe building style, and I'm curious if there's any link to the world of sensory development and children who've grown up in more of an earth-based community of those kinds of materials that you're talking about, if there's anything you have to contribute to that.
Sure. Do you want to?
Well, I agree with you. I think there's studies that show that they use pink in high security prisons because pink paralyzes you and makes you passive. girls should not have pink anything. Pink should not be allowed. It's not healthy for your brain. And having Adobe would be
Wow.
very healthy for your brain. And also getting dirty and working with Adobe and helping build, because that's what your brain needs to imagine how to build, right?
Yeah, I'm gonna get a little bit touchy-feely here, but if you've ever, how many of you have been in an Adobe building? Oh, well, amazing. And so, one thing that people often say when they go into a building that it feels so good.
And it smells delicious.
Yeah, there's senses that start to be excited by your body, and they're
It's cooling,
feelings.
right?
They're
It's
cooling. And so this is my touchy-feely part, which is that humans have been mushing around clay. At least we have evidence of that for the last 30,000 years. And in the last 10,000 years, we took these spaces that we made out of pottery and started to envelop our bodies with them. That's what we know all over the planet. That's what we know. That's what we did as humans to make our own habitats. And if you've evolved that long to make your space around you that way, it's part of your genetic makeup. It's part of your way of being. And so when you go into one of these buildings and you're like, wow, this feels so good, it's not, it's because you're returning home. And I would say my argument about the kids is that in these spaces, they might calm down, might feel better, because they are now in a space. I've worked with scientists to try to make artificial nests for birds and artificial habitat for other animals. And it's really, really hard to get an animal to convince them to go into a geodesic dome, you know? But get it to a building made of earth or sticks or whatever it evolved to do, it feels comfortable for them. And I think that's the same for humans.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much for
Thank
being
you.
here. I feel
Thank you.
honored to
Thank
share
you.
the
Thank you
stage
for
with you.
having me.
Thank you all for coming.
Although there was a bear here.